Right. Welcome everyone to this second plenary of the AHE conference titled Resisting Erasure, Capital, Imperialism and Race in Palestine. And this is based on a forthcoming pamphlet published by Verso. And we're really lucky to have the three authors of that pamphlet here to speak about the work. Let me just begin by introducing myself. I'm Susan Newman. I'm based at the Open University and a member of the management committee, and I will be chairing this session. So I will, before handing over to the speakers, who will each speak for about 10-15 minutes before we open up for discussion, I'm just going to give them each a brief introduction in order of their contributions. So our first speaker is Hanieh, who is Professor of Political Economy and Global Development at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, University of Exeter, and Joint Chair in Middle East Studies at the Institute of International and Area Studies at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Adam's current research focuses on oil and capitalism, energy transitions, and the political economy of the Middle East. Our second speaker will be Rafeef Ziadah, who is Senior Lecturer in Politics and Public Policy in the Department of International Development here at King's College. Rafeef's research centers on the production of interdisciplinary scholarship that falls into three thematic areas: infrastructures and logistics, gender and feminism, race and radicalization. Oh, sorry, racialization. Please excuse me, Rafeef. Her recent research is broadly concerned with the political economy of maritime infrastructures and logistics, with a particular focus on the Middle East and East Africa. Finally, we'll have Robert Knox, who is Senior Lecturer in the School of Law and Social Justice at the University of Liverpool. Robert's research interests broadly encompass the relationship between law and the political economic structures of capitalism. He has specific expertise on public international law, particularly on the relationship in relationship to race and empire, public law with a focus on its relationship to neoliberalism, and legal theory, especially critical and Marxist approaches to the law. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Adam for the first contribution.
Okay, so yeah. Thank you very much, Susan, and thanks very much for the AHE for inviting us to present our pamphlet. What I wanted to do in my short introductory remarks today is just look at some of the broader themes and arguments that we try to make in the pamphlet and set it against some of the ways in which Palestine is typically understood by many today. And I think these conversations that hopefully we'll have today fit very nicely with many of the themes in the conference, questions of imperialism, questions of the climate, and of course political economy and the broader dynamics in the region. The motivations for this pamphlet, maybe I'll just begin saying a few words about that. Obviously, over the last 18 months or so, the genocide in Gaza has become a lightning rod or leading edge of a deep-seated political radicalization, a political radicalization on both the left. We've seen huge demonstrations globally. We've seen the student encampments. We've seen the workers take action, blocking ports and all across the world. But also on the right, it's very clear that Palestine has become, if you like, the focus of a lot of the right-wing reaction that we see, whether it be in this country or in the United States and Europe more broadly. So it's our motivations for speaking and intervening in these kinds of discussions really comes from, if you like, a feeling of that much of the analysis is quite inadequate in how Palestine is thought about. There are problems with the way that Palestine is framed in everyday consciousness and also in the media. Too often, the question of Palestine is exceptionalized. And what we mean by this is that it's viewed simply through the lens of what is going on in Gaza or the West Bank or in Israel and the political leadership in Israel. And because of this framing, the solidarity with Palestine is frequently reduced to the questions of Israel's massive human rights abuses, the attacks on an entrapped population in Gaza, the destruction of schools, the destruction of infrastructure, and of course, in the last few weeks, shooting at starving people waiting to try to find food. These massive human rights abuses are often pictured as the framework in which solidarity is organized. Looking at these ongoing violations of international law, the killings, the arrests, the dispossession that Palestinians have experienced for nearly 8 decades. But the problem with this kind of human rights framing is that it depoliticizes the Palestinian struggle, and it fails to explain why Western states continue, and particularly the United States, but also the UK, continue to support Israel so unequivocally. And when this question of Western support for the Israeli state is raised, many point to the actions of a supposed lobby, pro-Israel lobby, that it operates in North America and Western Europe as the cause of American policy, British policy, and support of Israel. And we wanted to very unequivocally point out in this pamphlet that we disagree with that framing. It is not the result of the lobby that drives Western support for Israel. And we believe this is a false and politically dangerous perspective of understanding the relationship between Western states and Israel. It gets it fundamentally wrong. So we wanted in this pamphlet to break with these kinds of lobby-centric explanations of Western support, these kinds of exceptionalizing Palestine or a focus simply on the question of human rights and international law, and instead place Palestine in a global context in which Israeli settler colonialism operates, and the particular conjuncture of global capitalism that we currently are living. And hence, I think, the relevance to many of the themes that are being discussed at this conference. And of course, given the current moment, the relevance to the expansion, wider expansion of the war regionally in the Middle East with the bombing of Iran, and when many of the points I'm going to raise today really deeply, I think, connect very much to understanding this wider expansion of the war regionally. So let me run through some of the key arguments, and then I'll hand over to Rafeef and Rob to detail some more. The first thing I would say here is that we need to see Israeli settler colonialism, and both Rafeef and Rob will talk more about this concept of settler colonialism, and to view the more than 80 years dispossession of Palestinians in the Middle East within the crucial regional place of the Middle East in how our oil-centered world emerged from the middle of the 20th century onwards. So a key point that we're trying to make in this pamphlet is that it is impossible to understand Israel, Western support for Israel, and Israel's actions, both in Gaza and more regionally and globally, without situating this in the regional context of the Middle East, and in particular, the place of oil in global capitalism from about the middle of the 20th century onwards, when oil emerged as the principal fossil fuel, supplanting coal from about the Second World War onwards, and of course, launching what climate scientists describe as the Great Acceleration, the climate emergency that we are currently living in very disastrous ways today. So that transition, the transition to oil as the principal fossil fuel, is a key to understanding the place of the Middle East in the global economy, but also Western support for Israel. And I'll come to this in a second. The second thing, of course, that occurred alongside this transition to oil as the leading fossil fuel in the middle of the 20th century was the rise of the United States as the dominant capitalist power, displacing older European colonialism in much of the world, European colonial powers like Britain and France. So we try to situate our understanding of the region in this dual transition, the transition to oil on one side and the transition to American global dominance that took place around that same time, post-World War II. Because the Middle East was key to both of these dual transitions. It was the major site of the world's oil supplies outside of the US and Soviet Union in the middle of the 20th century. And in this role, it underpinned the American-led oil to coal transition in Western Europe and later the rest of the world. And most important here were the oil-rich Gulf monarchies, in particular Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and the smaller Gulf states in the Arabian Peninsula. So this transition to oil, as I said, occurred alongside the rise of the United States, the displacement of older European colonial order. And in the Middle East, it was founded upon the US alliance with Saudi Arabia from the 1950s onwards, really deepening through the 1970s, 1980s, and through to today. At that time, Saudi Arabia, and it remains the site of the largest oil exports globally, and the Saudi-US alliance was really a key part of American global power. And I'll come back to this relationship in a little bit later. The second pillar, of course, to American dominance in the Middle East, remember this is a time when Britain, in particular British colonialism, is faltering. French colonial rule is also faltering with the rise of anti-colonial national liberation movements in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria, across the region as a whole. But the second pillar to American power in the Middle East was, of course, Israel, particularly after the 1967 war, in which Israel destroyed the armed forces and political legitimacy of states like Egypt and anti-colonial movements such as Nasserism in Egypt. Egypt at that time was the center of these Arab anti-colonial revolts. So from 1967 onwards, Israel became the core American ally alongside Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, backed by billions in military and financial subsidies from the United States. Of course, prior to 1967, it had been British colonialism that had been the main supporter of Israel. And of course, the British state remains very much linked and part of this American-centered order in the region, but it was the United States that took over particularly after 67. And a key reason for this was Israel's settler colonial character. In other words, it was built upon the expulsion and dispossession of the majority Palestinian population living in Palestine through 1947, 1948, the Nakba, the expulsion of the majority of that population. And as a settler colony, like Israel, settler colonies must work to fortify structures of racial oppression, class exploitation, and dispossession. And as a result, they tend to be highly militarized societies and violent and reliant upon external support for their material privileges in a hostile regional environment. We can take the analogy here, as we briefly discussed in the pamphlet, with South African apartheid, another settler colony that played a similar role in the African continent. And this is why both British colonialism earlier on supported the establishment of Israel and the expulsion of the Palestinian population, and why American support remains so central today. Israel's social and economic character, the character of this settler colonial state, gives it this particular place within the bigger architecture of American global power. This is important because it runs against kind of the mainstream view that, the United States is kind of tail-ending what Israel wants to do, or might be in some ways, a broker for peace. Actually, it's the opposite connection. It's the dispossession, it's the racial structures of settler colonialism that gives Israel such a fundamental place in American power, different from other client regimes like Jordan or Egypt in the region because of this particular social structure. Now, why is this so important today? This is the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s that I've been discussing. These two main pillars of American power in the region, the United States and Saudi Arabia and Israel, remain so through today. And in fact, over the last 2 decades, we've seen American strategy try to knit together these two main allies through normalizing the relationships between the Gulf states and Israel through various economic agreements that Rafeef is going to speak to in a second, and political and diplomatic normalization. This has been a long-standing process going back through the 1990s Oslo process, which Rafeef will speak to. It was accelerated under the first Trump administration with the Abraham Accords, which saw Israel normalize with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and some other Arab states at that time. And it remains very true today with this deep push by the US administration under both Biden and Trump to see Israel and Saudi Arabia normalize their relationships. So this is really critical because it comes at a time of broader relative decline of American power globally. And in this sense, the region itself is ever more important to how US global strategy is articulated. So I'm going to just make some final points here and deal with a couple of common misconceptions. What I'm saying is I'm not saying that what the United States is interested in is dominating the region's oil supplies, taking control of Saudi oil or anything like that. That is not the case. The region's vast oil supplies remained under the control of national oil companies like Saudi Aramco, the biggest oil company in the world. But the key point is that these oil exports and gas exports from the Gulf region now flow eastwards. They flow to China and to East Asia. There has been a huge seismic shift in the global oil market in the last 2 decades, where the region's oil exports, the biggest oil and gas exports in the world, no longer go to Western Europe or the United States. They flow eastward to China and East Asia. And with the sale of this oil comes enormous financial surpluses accumulating in the Gulf region, in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar and other Gulf states. These dollar reserves, these dollar surpluses, are recirculated into American financial markets through a variety of mechanisms that I'm happy to talk about perhaps in the discussion. But we see very much the way that both the region's oil exports as well as these petrodollar recycling into US markets are quite important to US power, because in the event of any kind of deeper conflict with China, what happens to that oil and also what happens to those dollars will be a prime determinant of any kind of future conflict between the US and China. So basically, the way we've framed this pamphlet is in this bigger picture of thinking about US dominance, thinking about the region's relevance to the trajectories of that dominance, and the ways in which US strategy is now founded upon bringing together these two historic pillars of its power in the region, Israel and Saudi Arabia, the broader Gulf monarchies, under its umbrella to kind of reassert American primacy in the region. I think very much today, thinking about what's going on in Iran, the attack on Iran illustrates this in a very clear way. So maybe I'll leave it there and pass it on to Rafeef.
Many thanks to all colleagues at the HEA for inviting us, but also for creating this space. It takes so much energy, time, and effort to organize conferences like this. So thank you all so much for putting the effort to open up this conversation around Palestine in a central way at the conference as well. Since October 2023, Israel's war on Gaza has unfolded with ruthless destruction and human suffering that has been broadcast to the world in harrowing detail. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble, residential buildings, hospitals, schools, vital infrastructure obliterated. For those of us in the university sector, there is not a single university still standing in Gaza. The intensity of the bombing has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians. Many are still under the rubble, and has left thousands permanently maimed, with amputations performed without anesthesia in makeshift operating rooms. Gaza today has one of the world's highest rates of child amputees globally. Let that sink in. Gaza today has one of the highest rates of child amputees globally. Israel's blockade of food, water, and medicine has driven Gaza into catastrophic conditions, with famine now taking hold across the population and people being shot down simply for trying to go to the so-called humanitarian centers to pick up food. The scale of the devastation is staggering, and it's very difficult for people to even recognize what this has meant. For Palestinians, Gaza was our last safe place on the Mediterranean Sea. And today, Gaza is in ruins. Cultural landmarks have been erased. Entire families, entire bloodlines have been wiped out. The healthcare system has been systematically dismantled. Hospitals, medical personnel, and ambulances. Yet Israel's genocide, I want to argue, is not just what we have seen in the last 2 years. It continues a decade-long project of displacing, fragmenting, and erasing Palestinian life, a process that began with the Nakba in 1948, when over 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled from our homes to become refugees. Today, when the so-called US President Donald Trump, I mean so-called as in so-called human, says he wants to relocate Palestinians to other places, this is just overtly acknowledging ethnic cleansing. And saying that they want to implant a Riviera is nothing but a neoliberal dream that has its echoes in the Oslo Accords long before. What does this have to do with heterodox economics whatsoever? Well, in Palestine, mainstream economics has for a very long time thrived on a very dangerous fiction, that the economic can be neatly separated from the political. In the Palestinian context, this has meant presenting economic development as away from anything political, bypassing Palestinian rights altogether. As I hope many of you in this room would think, this division is not analytical, it's ideological. It allows mainstream economists to talk about economic development in Palestine without ever naming the illegal occupation, the apartheid regime, or settler colonialism. So in this talk, I want to insist on something quite different than mainstream economics, that we take seriously the political economy of settler colonial capitalism, not as a background, but as a structure. Settler colonialism is not just about land grabs, checkpoints, or wars. It's about the systemic reorganization of space, labor, capital, and life itself. It's about making indigenous economies dependent, fragmented, and disciplining resistance through markets as much as it is through military force. I'm always slightly baffled that in the world of heterodox economics, there is very little written about Palestine from non-Palestinians. And here, I think there's a persistent Orientalism and exceptionalism of Palestine that scares economists, heterodox or not, from actually talking about the region. So in this vein, I wanted to speak about the Oslo Accords that were signed in 1993 and at the time celebrated as a peace process. This was also a bonanza for mainstream economists that were saying, finally, you're going to have economic development in this case. But under the surface, Oslo institutionalized a colonial subcontracting model. It was not a deviation from the neoliberal global order. It was actually a tool of it. A framework for economic integration that restructured Palestinian political claims into managerial economistic problems and facilitated the embedding of Israeli capital into the wider region. all under US and European supervision. And this has been the process we are stuck with to this moment. This idea that you can have economic integration across the region without liberation for Palestinians. The Oslo Accords handed the Palestinian Authority limited administrative control, not sovereignty, over fragmented and isolated areas of the West Bank and Gaza, while Israel retained strategic, economic, and military control. And again, quite often when people speak about Palestine, they will speak about the militarism, but not the structures of economic control that developed under the Oslo Accords. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that in the hopes that we can have a conversation about how to do more of this work of analyzing the political economy of settler colonialism. Before Oslo, Palestinian labor, for example, was vital to Israeli agriculture and construction. But after the First Intifada, Israel moved to replace Palestinian workers with a more compliant workforce, bringing in more workers from Thailand, the Philippines, and Eastern Europe, for example. Palestinians were turned into a disposable reserve army of labor, highly controlled, switchable by permits, and politically defanged. Because there were a lot of strikes during the First Intifada, Palestinian labor had a huge role in shutting down the Israeli economy. So what Israel did was actually replace this labor. As employment in Israel dried up, many Palestinians then became dependent on the Palestinian Authority for jobs, funded not by a productive economy, but by foreign aid and taxes funneled or withheld by Israel. This was the economic formulation that was created by the Oslo Accords. This is what Palestinian economists term the captive economy, whose levers, fiscal, monetary, and infrastructural, all remained in Israeli hands. So while Oslo was sold as a peace process, economically, it was about creating deep dependency that has fragmented the Palestinian body politic in multiple ways. This fragmentation was, of course, also spatial. Oslo spatialized Palestinian life into Bantustans. It created what so-called areas A, B, and C. Area C, by the way, was the majority of the West Bank, around 70% of the West Bank, and that remained under Israeli control. Area A was the smallest, and that is the place where the Palestinian Authority had some administrative capacity. By some administrative capacity, I mean they were allowed to collect garbage and run hospitals, but nowhere close to anything like sovereignty. So areas A, B, and C were under varying controls by Israel, but all ultimately under the boot of the Israeli state and the Israeli military. Through checkpoints, walls, settler bypass roads, and zoning restrictions, Palestinians were divided not just politically, but also economically. For example, Jerusalem was historically the commercial hub for the West Bank. Historically, Jerusalem was the economic life of the West Bank, but Jerusalem was severed. Things like water, electricity, telecoms, all remained tied to Israeli infrastructure, and actually Palestinians, when they pay their bills, they're actually paying them to Israeli companies, not to any Palestinian companies. I say this because these are the basics of economic life, and when we think of economic sovereignty, we would think these are the capacities that would be built for sovereignty or self-determination, and none of this existed under the Oslo Accords. The 1994 Paris Protocol was the institutionalization of this dependency in economic terms. The Paris Protocol was the economic arm of the Oslo Accords. It locked the Palestinian territories into a customs union with Israel without the power to set tariffs or trade independently. So Palestine was never allowed to have an economy, if we think of Palestine as the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinians could not build an independent economy. They imported mostly from Israel, around 80 to 90%, and could only export mostly to Israel, and used the Israeli shekel because they were not allowed to have an independent currency. Of course, this exposing them to deep inflation that they couldn't control. Worse, 50% of the Palestinian Authority's income came from taxes that were collected by Israel. And of course, to this day, what Israel does is whenever it wants to put pressure on the Palestinian Authority, it withholds these taxes. Now, this is very important for economic life in the West Bank because, as I mentioned, the majority of workers in the West Bank and in Gaza actually rely on the Palestinian Authority and the public sector for jobs. So when Israel withholds these taxes, it means they're not paid for the month. So as already the salaries for most workers in the West Bank are very low, not having those taxes from Israel means that people are, for the past 2 years, have been receiving only about 30 to 50% of their salaries. And although the focus has been on the remarkable dystopic destruction of Gaza, what is uncommented about is also this pacification by destroying people's livelihoods, by making sure they cannot even get their paycheck at the end of the day. All to say that in the end, Oslo did not fail. There's usually comments by Oslo proponents that if only the peace process could have gone well. But Oslo, for what it was designed to do, was actually really successful. It created a Palestinian leadership that was willing to sign onto deals. It also created a leadership that followed every diktat of the World Bank and the IMF. Because, of course, like every other place in the global south, public services were decimated. Anytime there was a loan from the IMF-guided reforms meant that there would be pressure on the public sector to reduce wages and to privatize, except for one area, the area of security. The highest budget of the Palestinian Authority, if you look at GDP, continues to be security. So the policing of Palestinians by Palestinians for Israel. I want to move quickly to the regional dynamics behind all of this as well, because again, I think there is a way we exceptionalize and take out Palestine from the rest of the region, but it's important to understand the economics of Oslo within the regional patterns. If we widen the lens of Oslo, we would remember that this process was a linchpin in a much larger US-led project involving the war on Iraq, but also about integrating Israel, as Adam was saying, into the economic architecture of the Middle East more broadly, especially the Gulf. This was not incidental, it was part of a plan. From the standpoint of Israeli capital, the post-1980s economic pivot from agriculture and labor-intensive sectors towards high-tech, military R&D and finance demanded global integration. But at the time, there was Arab League secondary boycotts. It was harder for Israel to integrate those sectors internationally. So the big push at the time, for those who cast their mind back to that period, it was all about how to integrate capital across the region. The US-sponsored MENA economic summits between 94 and 98 were all about creating a Middle East free trade area. This is also the period where we got qualified industrial zones. Those were produced both in Jordan and Egypt. One of the most extraordinary cases of trilateral neoliberalism in the region at the time. To get duty-free access to US market goods had to be co-produced with Israeli capital. So for Jordanian and Egyptian goods to get access to the US market, they had to involve Israeli capital in these qualified industrial zones. These zones didn't just bind Arab and Israeli firms together under US supervision, they spatially disciplined labor as well, especially women, into low-wage export work. Jordan's economy by 2007 was so entangled in this framework that over 70% of its US exports came from qualified industrial zones. So this project that Adam was mentioning and that we talk about in this pamphlet was a project of economic integration, but centrally also a project to discipline labor across the region. That's why in some of the phantasmical imaginaries you see the Netanyahu government putting out about Gaza today, for example, in a plan he put out called Gaza 2030, Gaza was imagined as a free trade zone that would be interconnected to Neom in Saudi Arabia, where there would be cheap labor. This concept of Gaza as a resource of cheap labor is not new. It has been under development for quite a long time. And of course, to this day, we are still in the continuing afterlife of this Oslo framework. Although the second intifada did happen in the 2000s, it was framed as Oslo failing, but really what it was a cry from the Palestinian body politic to reject this captive economy. And here we saw an intensification of Israeli colonialism. The apartheid wall was built, the zoning restrictions became worse, the permits in order to work became much, much worse, and we saw the infrastructural apartheid taking hold. But all of this was developed way earlier under the so-called peace process. Those economic dynamics that were very rarely written about in the euphoria of Oslo were what led us to today. And if you look back at that time, there was hardly any economist outside of Palestine that was talking about the Paris Protocol or the economics of settler colonialism and how they were operating. So I just want to wrap up maybe with a word around heterodox economics and what on earth we are doing. Because to put it very bluntly, what I'm trying to say is that the genocide we are seeing in Gaza today does not break with Oslo. It's actually the culmination of that process and the culmination of separating economics from politics. Oslo enabled a regional project in which Israeli security and capital expansion could proceed unimpeded, while Palestinians were boxed in, starved, and bombed into submission. The economic capacity of the population was destroyed. It was a process of economic pacification, along with the militarism that worked hand in hand, as they often do in settler colonial contexts. So if Oslo teaches us anything, it's that technocratic economics divorced from history, power, and the struggle helps to entrench dispossession. Heterodox economists have a responsibility here, not just to critique neoliberalism in the abstract, but to confront how it operates through occupation, borders, and militarized capital, even in places that some might find uncomfortable to look at. There are tools that we can bring to these discussions: structural analysis, a deep understanding of dependency and imperialism, and a refusal to treat politics as noise in a model. But critique is not enough. After what we have seen in the last 2 years, a lot of people tend to finish these talks by saying Gaza is a model for all our future, and that might be the case. But I don't want people to care about Gaza because you're afraid about your own future. It's because there are human beings that are trying to survive there every single day. And this means that we need to get over our own Orientalist assumptions and do some serious work for the people on the ground to understand Israel's place in normalization infrastructures, to understand Israel's place in the green transition and how they are trying to position themselves within the green transition, selling settler colonialism as green and marketable, and also Israel's role in global militarism. There is so much to be done on the Palestinian banking sector and how it works, the monetary subjugation. All of those are topics that are ripe for all of you to speak about. And if you look at all the talks throughout this conference, there is barely anything on these topics. So let's work to deepen our analysis collectively, not just on Palestine, on the Middle East more broadly, and to center it. In short, after what we have seen, we can no longer allow for mainstream economics to simply project growth under occupation and try to market. The only thing that is left for us to fight for now is freedom, and hopefully all of us have a role to play in that. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bit of advice. If you want to feel like really smart and good about your ability to convey ideas, don't write a book with these two and then have to speak after them. Story of my life, I'm afraid. So to take it, so I kind of want to build on what both Adam and Rafeef have said, and specifically think about the role that race and racism play in our kind of analysis in the pamphlet and more broadly in our understanding of what's happening in Palestine, both locally and wider senses. So as we've already said, part of what we're trying to do, a big part of what we're trying to do, is avoid the kind of traps of fetishism and essentialism that people fall into, and exceptionalism, when they're talking about Palestine. And very often that takes the form, in both mainstream but also more radical or critical versions, of a kind of racial essentialism, right? In which you can be like, oh, because of these cultural, ethnic, or whatever histories, you have this irreconcilable conflict about which you can do nothing, right? And so often in this context, we totally lose the picture of the kind of materialist explanation that we're trying to do. There appears to be no class, no capitalism. It's just the endless kind of essentialized racial conflict in this way. And part of what we want to do, of course, is displace that. And one of the reasons we want to displace that is because, ironically enough, that itself is a racist explanation of the conflict, right? Of what's going on. Europeans get materialism, white people get explanation, and everyone else gets a little bit of like weird stereotyping, Orientalism, and as I've said before, like talk about olive trees and land as opposed to anything else. And we want to fight against that and instead put forward this kind of materialist analysis which explains this. However, at the same time, of course, any glance at the way in which these things have played out lets us understand that racist ideas, racist practices are clearly deeply embedded in the set of material relationships that we are talking about, right? And so alongside the kind of ceaseless struggle the three of us have waged against like fetishizing explanations of Palestine, we've also waged a ceaseless struggle against our comrades who think that race and racism are just things that you can place at the side while you talk about the real issues. We have many comrades who don't take things seriously. At the same time, so many ceaseless struggles, but another one is in the anti-racist movement itself, with anti-racists often thinking of Palestine not as an anti-racist issue, but as something that's going on out there in a different kind of way. So in this context, what we have tried to do, and I think hopefully have done quite successfully, is not simply neglect race or racism or think that the real stuff is material, but rather to put together a materialist account which takes seriously the role of race, racialization, and racism in the context of the social relations which we have described thus far, right? So rather than think that race is either determinative or irrelevant, we argue that, broadly speaking, capitalism has a close structural connection with racism and processes of racialization, and that racism and processes of racialization are absolutely central and key to these kind of material relationships. And our goal in the pamphlet has been to try and think then, in that context, what role has practices of racialization played overall, and how do those help us understand, in this materialist sense, the role of race and racism in Palestine, which we think gives a better political foundation upon which to kind of conduct this. So on that basis, right, we really understand that, especially in the context of imperialism, capitalism's central kind of dynamic of expansion and transformation always appears as forms and practices of racialization, right? Capitalism has, from its outset, been so deeply intertwined with these practices of racialization that the way in which capitalism presents itself to us and the way in which processes of accumulation are managed and articulated is in this racialized language, right? And a brief look at history would kind of display this in the contemporary scene. This is very clear in the context of Palestine. And understanding that role of racialization in Palestine is really significant for us, right? So obviously then, to begin with, in the history of Palestine, you can see that the kind of changing role of Palestine in imperial configurations was always undergirded by processes and practices of racialization. So the kind of beginning issue of the British kind of initial colonization of Palestine and the facilitation of settlers came about in part because at the end of the Second World War, a series of institutional bodies in the mandate system, undergirded by ideas of civilization and of the inability of non-Europeans to manage their own affairs, placed Palestine under the administration of the British. So it's in this context, right, that you facilitate that first moment through that institutionalized racial language. And this, of course, was part and parcel of the British state's own attempt to project its imperial power in the region through establishing a kind of European, like, settler state, which would owe an allegiance to Britain. And as Adam has already discussed, that's a pattern which marks the kind of role of the Israeli state more broadly throughout the historical thing. So we have already this background that actually the initial forms of expansion into the region are mediated through this racial language. At the same time as this, as Adam has pointed out, Israel, as itself a kind of settler colonial capitalist project, is fundamentally undergirded by, like necessarily undergirded by, a series of racialized tropes about Palestine. Initially, of course, in the language of making the desert bloom or whatever, you have this idea that the Palestinians were incapable of cultivating land, were incapable of managing their own affairs, and this justified European expansion, dispossession, etc., etc., etc. This was, of course, matched by a language of the kind of savagery of the Arab world, of the necessity of the nascent Israeli state to use violence against this savagery and against these kind of people who were incapable of managing their own affairs, right? That became a crucial dynamic in the kind of consolidation and spread of Israeli capitalism. And that undergirds necessarily the Israeli state's actions and practices today. And you can see this in the juridical arrangements of the Israeli state, which are actively continue reinforcing this dispossession and inferiority of the Palestinian people. But as Rafeef has pointed out, and I think this is crucial, sometimes when people think about this kind of settler colonialism and racism thing, they reduce this simply to a dynamic of extermination, of us versus them, which doesn't capture the proper complexities of understanding those material relationships. So as Rafeef has pointed out already, in particular, the question of Palestinians and their relationship to labor becomes a crucial area to be managed, and it's managed through racialization, right? You can even see this today in the way in which how has the Israeli state replaced the kind of surplus population of Palestinians through the importation of other forms of racialized labor, Thai workers, whatever, who serve in this context a not dissimilar role. Now, one of the crucial dynamics that racialization has taken in the context of the Israeli state's management of the Palestinians has been through this language of security and terrorism. And it's a very specific racial dynamic which comes to play here and has then played an outsized role in the kind of regional capitalist accumulation projects that Adam has already described, and also in terms of governing the kind of class formation in the Palestinian territories. So essentially, relying, I think, on centuries possibly of like forms of like racialized argument, the Israeli state designates the Palestinian people as a whole as a continual threat to security, right? Specifically because their kind of Palestinian people are unknowable, lack a kind of modern, sophisticated military, et cetera, they are designated as a continual possible and potential threat, right, militarily, and one which is ironically dubbed as being possibly genocidal, et cetera. So in this sense, a pattern of racialization reduces the entire Palestinian population to either terrorists or potential terrorist supporters. And that has been a guiding kind of position of the Israeli state, especially since the kind of defeat of the bigger anti-colonial movements. This has been the move that the Israeli state has done to sell racialization. This has been crucial because this racialized language of security is central to essentially the Israeli state calibrating how it will manage these populations at different points. This language enables the kind of policing and checkpointing, which is not just about managing movement per se, but has this deeper logic, up to and including the assassination of Palestinian political leaders, the murder of various Palestinian people, all under this rubric, often juridical and legal, of self-defense and defense against this unknowable threat. As you can see recently, right, that has extended further, but we will talk about that in a second. So what we see in this context is a shift towards this language of security. Now, this language of security has actually been crucial in the wider set of regional arrangements that we heard both Adam and Rafeef talk about, right? So one of the very significant things is that that language of a racialized threat and of security is one of the things that undergirds and underpins the pact between the Israeli state and the US in this kind of way. This language of racialized terrorism has undergirded US policy in the region, enabled the US to intervene in various ways. And actually, quite literally, you can see from Netanyahu writing a series of not very good academic articles about terrorism, that the Israeli state sold essentially the program of the war on terror to the US. So the Israeli state's racialization of the Palestinians undergirded a wider regional management project of capital accumulation through this racialized language of terrorism. And actually, I'm an international lawyer, so this I know, is a quite recent innovation and invention. So in this sense, you get both the kind of direct management of Palestinians through this form of racialization, but also a kind of regional racial alliance between the US, its allies, and others, justifying the deployment of force. So on the one hand, then, this form of racialization underpins that regional regime. But also, crucially, the dynamic of security is not just a dynamic of, oh, let's invade. It's also been, crucially, a transformative dynamic for the accumulation of capital. So one of the ways in which normalization happens and in which the kind of elites and ruling classes of the Gulf states have been integrated into this US project is through the language of security. That operates either as a carrot or as a stick. It can happen either way. And many of the ruling classes on this basis have agreed to a US security-led process under the ambit of like dealing with a racialized terrorist threat, which also, usefully for them, enables them to police their own domestic enemies in this kind of way. So this particular mode of racialization that comes initially from the Israeli state of casting Palestinians as this infinite racialized threat and security problem helped undergird both the US's project in the region and also the disciplining and integration of local ruling classes into that US project. So what you get here is this racialized language underpins much of this. At the same time, of course, in a more vulgar but important sense, lots of the Israeli state's own literal political economy, its reputation for like new technology, it's a startup state, blah, 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 is premised on the idea of the Israeli state as a kind of unique power for managing these racial antagonisms and security threats. So the Israeli state has also marketed itself, right, as a central, useful way of dealing with this in this kind of ways. And this often underpins, I think, the kind of more spectacular forms of violence that the Israeli state has like unleashed. And if one were to be vulgar, for instance, I would be like, although many people often think of the kind of Israeli AI-led bombing as some kind of critique, for many firms in the Israeli state, they're like, free advertising, like, look what we're doing here, right? So we have this alignment in this way. So we have these changing patterns of racialization, which I think underpin and undergird this regional settlement, and they are linked fundamentally with these projects of accumulation in the region. But they also have wider ranging effects in particular ways. So I'm just going to take very briefly the example of Britain and the idea of how it is these racialized languages manage forms of resistance, solidarity, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, we have a very obvious thing to say, which is that we know that the British state and other states have articulated much of their domestic power and their ability to surveil the left, anti-racist movements, et cetera, through the language of the threat of terrorism. So outside of just the deployment of military force, this racialized idea of terrorism has been adopted by many states and used to police their own populations. And as we've seen recently, police them specifically in relation to Palestine solidarity activism, right? And this operates in more or less subtle ways. Like I'm sure many people who've worked at universities in Britain have been like, we've got a prevent officer. If someone stops eating bacon, I have to report them to prevent. That seems racist because it is. But the point is that we get this thing here. And we see this, of course, in the language of the media, in the language of politicians, where, again, look at the kind of the discourse around Iran. The first thing people say is the Israeli state has a right to defend itself in a kind of ritualized invocation, which relies upon the fact that despite the fact that the Israelis were clearly not being very fucking defensive, there is an imaginary which says, well, Iran is the real and ever-present threat, which is embodied institutionally in the logic of the war on terror and its racial management. So this comes in this way. So on the one hand, we have this. But on the other hand, and I think this kind of links to Rafeef's final point, we have what we call in the pamphlet this idea of bread and butter racism. And this is the idea that it's not, the way in which racism operates here about Palestine is not simply in the idea that it's like, you're a terrorist, you're wearing keffiyeh. It also is like, why do you care about this? It's the idea that caring about Palestine is somehow a strange, cranky or awkward thing. This is one of the things I think was used to delegitimize Corbyn, for instance, not just anti-Semitism claims, but also like, why do you care about this? This is not a bread and butter issue. So alongside the direct racialization in this way, in this kind of aggressive way, what we also see is an articulation of an idea that the concerns of people who basically aren't white and aren't in Britain are not legitimate concerns for you to care about. And this operates very insidiously. The obvious place we should mention this is in the trade union movement, where you have a counterposition of real trade union issues, wages, conditions, etc., with Palestine solidarity seen as in some sense like, well, you can do that, but just do it on your own time. And this is a subtle form of racialization, which essentially treats the interests of these other people who are part of a global working class as separate and irrelevant from these bread and butter issues, right? I think that is also one of the reasons that you see people in anti-racist movements not fully understanding Palestine as an anti-racist struggle. So very briefly, because I've gone a little bit over time, what does that mean for us? Well, I think the first thing it means, again, to push with what Rafeef has said, we have to understand racism, racialization, and race not as things that are separate from the kind of intellectual inquiries that we do, but rather part and parcel of the way in which capitalism realizes itself on the world stage. That also means that we cannot treat Palestine as an exception, because actually it is part and parcel of the way in which racialized forces of capital accumulation sustain our world. And on this basis, right, our idea of bread and butter politics has to include the defense and solidarity with the Palestinian people, because that is part and parcel of those very forces that we are confronting today.
Thank you. So, is this working? Yeah. Thank you so much to our three panelists. That was, I mean, that sort of reflects a little bit, you know, the quality of the pamphlet itself, which I think in very, very few words is able to articulate so many complex ideas and to connect them to a materialist analysis and historical analysis of the situation. It really does cut through a lot of the confusion in the movement in the UK at the moment, and I would recommend everyone read it when it comes out.